Once again responding to the CES letter, we are still in section 1 titled The Book of Mormon. This will be issue number 9. Now before I actually get into the issue, I did forget to mention a few disclaimers. This is my own personal opinion and answer to the issues raised in the CES letter. I do not speak for the church, nor do I speak for its leaders. It is my own thoughts. So let us take a look at it. Issue number 9. The Late War Between the United States and Great Britain. This book was an 1819 textbook written for New York State school children. The book depicted the events of the War of 1812, and it was specifically written in a Jacobean English style to imitate the King James Bible. This affected scriptural style was calculated to elevate the moral themes, characters, and events depicted in the narrative to inspire the readers to patriotism and piety. Readers already accustomed to revere scriptural-sounding texts in the ancient Bible would be predisposed to revere this history book, which employs the same linguistic style. The first chapter alone is stunning, as it reads incredibly like the Book of Mormon. Quote, verse 1, chapter 1, verse 1 through 4. Now it came to pass in the 1812th year of the Christian era, and in the 36th year after the people of the provinces of Columbia had declared themselves a free and independent nation, that in the 6th month of the same year, on the first day of the month, the chief governor, whom the people had chosen to rule over the land of Columbia, even James, whose surname was Madison, delivered a written paper to the great Sanhedrin of the people who were assembled together. And the name of the city where the people were gathered together was called after the name of the chief captain of the land of Columbia, whose fame extended to the uttermost parts of the earth, albeit he had slept with his fathers. End quote. In addition to the above King James Version language style present throughout the book, what are the following Book of Mormon verbatim phrases, themes, and storylines doing in a children's school textbook that was used in Joseph Smith's own time and backyard, all of this a mere decade before the publication of the Book of Mormon? First, devices of curious workmanship in relation to boats and weapons, a stripling soldier with his weapon of war in his hand. A certain chief captain was given in trust a band of more than 2,000 chosen men to go forth to battle, and who all gave their services freely for the good of their country. Fortifications, the people began to fortify themselves and entrench the high places round about the city, objects made partly of brass and partly of iron, and were cunningly contrived with curious works, like unto a clock, and as it were a large ball. Their polished steel of fine workmanship. Nevertheless, it was so that the freemen came to the defense of the city, built strongholds and forts, and raised up fortifications in abundance. 3 Indian prophets, rod of iron, war between the wicked and righteous, maintaining the standard of liberty with righteousness, righteous Indians versus savage Indians, false Indian prophets, conversion of Indians, bands of robbers, pirates, marauding the righteous protagonists, engraving records. And it came to pass that a great multitude flocked to the banners of the great Sanhedrin, compared to Alma 62:5. And it came to pass that thousands did flock unto his standard, and did take up their swords in defense of their freedom. Worthiness of Christopher Columbus, ships crossing the ocean, a battle at a fort where righteous white protagonists are attacked by an army made up of dark-skinned natives driven by a white military leader. White protagonists are prepared for battle and slaughter their opponents to such an extent that they fill the trenches surrounding the fort with dead bodies. The surviving elements flee into the wilderness and forest. Cataclysmic earthquake followed by great darkness. Elephants, mammoths in America. Literary Hebraisms and Chiasmus. Boats and barges built from trees after the fashion of the ark. A bunch of it came to pass, and many, many more parallels, which they have a link for. The parallels and similarities to the Book of Mormon are astounding. This webpage, which they give a link to, outlines very clearly and simply just how phenomenally unlikely it is that so many common rare phrases and themes could be found between these books without the late war having had some influence on the Book of Mormon. Former BYU Library Bibliographic Department Chairman and antique book specialist Rick Grunder states in his analysis of the late war, the presence of Hebraisms and other striking parallels in a popular children's textbook referring to the late war, on the other hand, so close to Joseph Smith in his youth, must sober our perspective. And that is the end. Okay, so that was issue number 9. And I will deal with that big list of parallels momentarily. It is kind of long, so I will reserve it for the end. Right now, let us discuss just a couple of points that he makes other than the parallels. So, in his first paragraph, he states that the affected scriptural style of the book is calculated to inspire the readers to patriotism and piety, as well as those already accustomed to revere the scriptural sounding text would be predisposed to revere his book. The problem is, and I've said it in previous videos, that the details matter. Because here he gets it backwards. He tries to claim the intent of the author, but in the author's own words, he gets it wrong. And so let us look at this. In the author's own words. In the preface of the book, The Late War, it states here, "The young pupil will acquire, with the knowledge of reading, a love for the manner in which the great truths of divine revelation are conveyed to his understanding, and this will be an inducement to him to study the Holy Scriptures." So it's not because, he's not saying that because people like the Bible, they'll like his book, as is claimed in the CES letter, but rather, he hopes that people will come to enjoy his book and understand the style, and therefore enjoy the Bible more. It's a complete reversal of what they claim. The other one, they claim that will inspire patriotism and piety. That does appear, the patriotism and piety appears in this preface. But what does it say here? "It will be read with pride and pleasure by every one of our young men, in whose bosom may glow the sentiments of patriotism and piety." In other words, if you already have those sentiments, if you are already patriotic and pious, then the text will appeal to you. You will enjoy reading the book. It's not calculated to inspire patriotism and piety, but it is calculated to be enjoyed by those who are already patriotic and pious. So the author of the CES letter makes two claims about the intent of the author of the late war, and he gets both wrong. This is just an indication that the author of the CES letter did not read the source material. He did not ever read the late war. He only read those snippets and those pieces that he cut and pasted from other anti-Mormon sources. Also, he then mentions the first chapter, he quotes the first 4 verses of the 4th chapter, claiming that it reads incredibly like the Book of Mormon. It also reads incredibly like the Bible, which is what it's imitating. But it's just simply using the Jacobean phraseologies. But it doesn't actually read like the Book of Mormon. It's a very, very different style of writing. It is clearly 2 different people writing. So, while it mimics the biblical phraseology, as the author of the book says in his preface, it does not actually sound any more like the Book of Mormon than it does like the Bible. He says how phenomenally unlikely it is that so many common, rare phrases and themes could be found between these books without the late war having had some influence on the Book of Mormon. Okay, the problem is that they do not give credit where credit is due. The late war has similar phraseology because it copies the Bible. The Book of Mormon was written by a people who came out of the Israelite or Hebrew or Jewish, whatever term you want to use, culture. The influence that is on both books is the Bible. There's no reason why the late war had there's no reason why we should assume that the late war had any influence on the Book of Mormon when we already know that the Bible was such a large influence. And it was an influence on both books. They both admit it. So the real likelihood is that both were simply influenced by the Bible, not that the Book of Mormon was influenced by the late war. And finally, they mention this quote from the BYU Library Bibliographic Department chairman. But who cares? Why should I listen to this guy? And this is the point where it really traces back again to my 5 truths at the beginning. My first video, I outlined the 5 truths that anytime anybody brings up any issue, any question, anything that comes to me that I hear of, there are 5 truths that I do not question, because I know they're true. I know they're true as surely as I know the sun shines. And one of those truths, the number 4, the 4th truth in my list, was that the Scriptures are true. They are the true Word of God. They teach true doctrine, and they teach true history. So nothing else matters. Given that that is true, why should I care what some guy in BYU says? This is, again, what they've done in many other issues, is they're trying to pit scholars against prophets. And they're asking, why doesn't the prophet agree with the scholar? Or they're saying, because a scholar said this, we should doubt the prophets. But that needs to be flipped around. Why don't the scholars agree with the prophets? And because the prophet said this, we should doubt the scholars. And that's what this is. This whole quote, the only reason for this quote is to try and pit a scholar, an LDS scholar, against the Scriptures and the prophets. And I just don't care. Talking of the parallels, let us go through this. There are 26, and I'm going to try and cover them all, so we're going to try and get through them as fast as possible, because I don't want the video to be too long. So, number 1, devices of curious workmanship in relation to boats and weapons. Now, first of all, the phrase curious workmanship is not an uncommon phrase. It appears in, the curious workmanship does not appear in the Bible specifically, but the Bible does talk about the curious girdle of the high priest. And in Exodus, it talks about working in curious works in gold and silver and brass, which it also mentions in Helaman in the Book of Mormon. Now, they do use the phrase curious workmanship in reference to the Liahona in 1 Nephi and Alma, as well as to ships in 1 Nephi and Alma, but they never use it in reference to weapons, as suggested in the letter. It is to ships, but never to weapons. Parallel number 2, a stripling soldier with his weapon of war in his hand. Now, first of all, the term stripling, it's uncommon in the modern day, but it is not a rare term. It was actually used fairly commonly back in the 1800s. The Bible itself uses it in 1 Samuel to refer to David. The Book of Mormon uses it only twice in the Book of Alma, but it is still used in the modern day. We have in the online publication called The Vulture, just 2 months ago, December 1st, 2021, a Matthew Jacobs wrote an article about the actress Kirsten Dunst and her portrayal of Marie Antoinette, in which he uses the term talking about her portrayal as an excitable stripling. So the term is not uncommon, and it is still used in the modern day. The rest of this quote, the weapons of war, this phrase as a plural weapons appears 9 times in the Bible. It does appear more in the Book of Mormon, but the reference to the Bible is clear. It is used singly once in Alma, but the phrase as quoted in the letter of with his weapon of war in his hand does not appear in the Book of Mormon in any form. Parallel 3, it states, a certain chief captain was given in trust a band of more than 2,000 chosen men to go forth to battle, end quote, and who, second quote, all gave their services freely for the good of their country. This is a clear attempt to make a parallel with the story of the 2,000 stripling warriors in the Book of Alma. However, these 2 quotes that are given are not of the same passage in the book, The Late War. They are actually separated by 268 pages, the first quote being on page 226, the second quote being on page 294. So this is a disingenuous, dishonest attempt to make a parallel that doesn't exist. Number 4, fortifications. The people began to fortify themselves and entrench the high places round about the city. This is too general of an issue to be an actual parallel. Cities have always been fortified. Usually a fort is placed in a higher place overlooking the city. However, the word entrench does not actually appear in the Book of Mormon, nor does the phrase high places. In the Bible, the term high places is used exclusively for religious shrines and altars built in the mountains. This parallel does not exist or is too general to mean anything. Okay, number 5. Objects made partly of brass and partly of iron, and were cunningly contrived with curious works, like unto a clock, and as it were a large ball. Now, first of all, this is talking about a torpedo in the late war, not a compass like the Liahona, which it is clearly trying to draw a parallel to. Also, it being made partly of brass and partly of iron, nothing in the Book of Mormon or even the Bible is made partly of both. It's either brass or iron. Also, the term cunning is never used to refer to any kind of material or object. It is only used in reference to a person's ability to influence others. So this, while it has some slightly similar words, is not a true parallel to anything in the Book of Mormon. And number 6, they're polished steels of fine workmanship. Now, in the late war, polished steels, this is referring to their swords. However, the term steel is used in the Book of Mormon 5 times, but it is also used in the Bible 4 times. However, the term polished appears in the Book of Mormon only once, when it is quoting the Bible, which uses the term 4 times. So, the parallel draws more closely to the Bible than it does to the late war. Number 7, nevertheless it was so that the freemen came to the defense of the city, built strongholds and forts, and raised up fortifications in abundance. This is another one that is simply too general. People always come to the defense of cities when they are being invaded. They defend the cities by building forts and raising fortifications. So this is something that can be taken from any history book or any story of any war in the history of the world. Number 8, 3 Indian prophets. Okay, now, any religious leader is going to be called by Christians to be prophets. That's what that's the Christian term for the spiritual leaders of almost any religion. This is a clear attempt to make a comparison to the 3 Nephite disciples in the Book of Mormon, who are promised that they will never taste death until after the return of Christ. But in the late war, these 3 prophets were all condemned as false prophets and were later killed. So the parallel there also does not truly exist. Number 9, rod of iron. This is a fairly common phrase, so that Joseph Smith would have heard it at other places is very likely. It is in the Bible. In Psalms 2:9, it talks about being broken with a rod of iron. In the book of Revelation, it talks 3 times of ruling with a rod of iron. This is the way it is used in the book The Late War, where it describes King George trying to rule over America with a rod of iron. It is only in the Book of Mormon in which this phrase is used as a metaphor for the Word of God. And therefore, the use of this common phrase is unique to the Book of Mormon. The parallel, again, does not truly exist. Number 10, war between the wicked and the righteous. In the Christian era, almost every war has been described as being between the wicked and the righteous. The Crusades were the righteous Christians going to battle against the wicked Muslims. So the idea is not unique to this book, The Late War, and therefore cannot be truly traced to it. The parallel is too general to be meaningful. Number 11, maintaining the standard of liberty with righteousness. Again, in the Christian era, almost every war was considered to be maintained by righteousness. So that is hardly surprising that it would be in the late war, nor would Joseph Smith need to have heard it from the late war. Now, the standard of liberty, that is also a fairly common thing. It appears in records of ancient wars, such as the Swiss fighting against the Austrians, or even the Greeks against the Persians. So again, it is too general to have any true meaning. Righteous Indians versus savage Indians, parallel number 12. Again, far too general. Indians fought on both sides of the War of 1812, as well as the Revolution, and in the previous French and Indian War, and the ones fighting on your side were generally characterized as being the righteous Indians, and your enemies were the savage Indians. This is not unique to the late war. And if those Indians had professed a faith in Christianity, as many did, they especially would be described as being righteous. So again, far too general to be a true parallel or to have any meaning to the Book of Mormon. Parallel number 13, false Indian prophets. Once again, far too general. The Christians believed that all Indian religious leaders were false prophets. In fact, they thought that any religious leader that was not Christian was a false prophet. This is a common idea, not unique to the late war, and would have been known to Joseph Smith through many sources. So again, far too general to have any meaning. Number 14, conversion of Indians. Again, I would classify this as being too general. Every Christian denomination was sending missionaries out to preach to the Indians, and any story of success would have been reported in the newspapers of the time. Joseph Smith did not need to read this book of the late war to have stories of such conversions known to him. Number 15, bands of robbers and pirates marauding the righteous protagonists. You are not going to find the history of any nation that is recorded over a 1,000-year period that does not mention robbers and pirates. They are a common theme of all history. And the fact that the people that they are preying on characterize themselves as being a righteous, or at least the good guys, is hardly surprising. Parallel number 16, engraving records. This is one that I found especially humorous because in the actual text of the late war, that it makes no mention of engraving records. What this reference is from a clerk's note at the beginning declaring the work to be in compliance with the current copyright laws. So let me read that just briefly here. Supplementary to an act entitled An Act for the Encouragement of Learning by securing the copies of maps, charts, and books to the authors and proprietors of such copies during the time therein mentioned, and extending the benefits thereof to the arts of designing, engraving, and etching historical and other prints. This is the only reference to engraving that appears in the book, and as I say, it is simply a clerk's note at the beginning declaring the book to be in compliance with these current copyright laws. There's no parallel to the text of the Book of Mormon. Number 17, we get two quotes here. And it came to pass that a great multitude flocked to the banners of the great Sanhedrin, quoted from the late war, compared to Alma 62:5, which states, And it came to pass that thousands did flock unto his standard, and did take up their swords in defense of their freedom. A military standard is simply a rallying point that has been used throughout history from the time of ancient Egypt. A standard can be a flag, it can be a banner, it can be a totem stuck on a pole. It is simply a point for the people to gather together for the purpose of military action. The fact that both of these mention it is hardly surprising given the fact that both books deal extensively with war. Parallel number 18. Worthiness of Christopher Columbus. In the early 1800s, most people revered Christopher Columbus as the discoverer of America. They even named the city, the capital city of the United States, after him, being Washington, the District of Columbia. The idea that Joseph Smith would have been unfamiliar with the greatness of Christopher Columbus before he read the late war is just silly, and the idea that the late war was the only source for this idea before the Book of Mormon makes no sense. Number 19, ships crossing the ocean. Any nation that has a coastline on the ocean is going to mention ships on the ocean in their history. This is probably the most broad and most general supposed parallel mentioned in this CES letter, and is just ridiculous. Okay, number 20 is a little bit more complicated and will take a little extra time to discuss, so I will be skipping it for now and completing the rest of the list, and we will come back to number 20 in just a moment. Parallel 21, cataclysmic earthquake followed by great darkness. Okay, let us take a look at what it says in the late war so that we can get a good appreciation of this. It says here, But as the young man returned to where the army stayed, behold, the black dust in the hold caught fire, and it rent the air with the noise of 1,000 thunders. And the whole army fell down upon their faces to the earth, and the stones and the fragments of rocks were lifted high, and the falling thereof was terrible, even unto death. Yea, it was dreadful as the mighty earthquake which overturneth cities. And the whole face of the earth round about and the army of Zebulun were overshadowed with black smoke, so that for a time one man saw not another. But when the heavy clouds of smoke passed away towards the west, behold, the earth was covered with the killed and the wounded. Okay, so what is going on in this passage? Basically, somebody accidentally ignited gunpowder, blew up a ship, and the explosion was so hot, was so powerful that it shook the earth, and is thus compared to an earthquake. Is not a literal earthquake, as is suggested by the claim of parallel in the CES letter. The black smoke that rose up from this explosion, that's a very nice description, but it blew away very shortly thereafterwards. In the Book of Mormon, which is what we are clearly trying to make a comparison to, we have a cataclysm that rocks 2 continents. Cities are sunk into the ocean, sunk into the earth, burned, blown away by whirlwinds, and then you have 3 days of vaporous darkness where you can't even light a fire. So we have metaphors being compared, metaphors of a temporary disaster compared to a major cataclysm that lasted for days. Number 22, elephants or mammoths in America. Okay, so first of all, we know the mammoths were in America. They were found in the early 1700s, bones of various types. Even President Thomas Jefferson was very fascinated with the mammoth and had several bones on display in his house while he was president. So they were here in America. Therefore, any book that claims to be a history of the American continents that mentions elephants, hardly surprising. The Book of Mormon, being a history of the American continents, should mention elephants, and the fact that the late war mentions them is not surprising, as it also deals with the American continents. Parallel number 23, Hebraisms, presence of Hebraisms or chiasmus in the text. For those who don't know, a chiasmus is a phrase, sentence, or passage in which the second half repeats the first half but in reverse order. For instance, in the Bible, we have Psalms chapter 3, verses 7 and 8 state, "Save me, O my God, for thou hast smitten all my enemies on the cheekbone. The teeth of the wicked thou hast broken. To Jehovah the salvation." We note, save me begins it, salvation ends it, my God, Jehovah, smitten or broken, and my enemies, the wicked, and cheekbone and teeth, in reverse order. This is what a chiasmus is. There is claims of one appearing in the book The Late War. I have not read it, so I am not positive on that point. There are some in the Book of Mormon. And the claim is that because they appear in the Late War, Joseph Smith could have recreated them in the Book of Mormon. The issue with this is that you have to explain how a young man with a 3rd grade education not only was able to recognize a chiasmus in the Late War, but was then able to reproduce, not really reproduce, but to produce a unique and original composition in this rhetorical form. The other thing to note is that the chiasmus is not unique to the Bible, the Book of Mormon, or the Late War, but is a common rhetorical device. It was particularly used frequently by Shakespeare, as well as many other ancient authors. Parallel 24, boats and barges built from trees after the fashion of the ark. Okay, first of all, both of these books are coming from an influence of the Bible. In the Late War, he states he's taking phraseology from the Bible. So in the Bible, what boat are you going to compare other boats to other than the ark? In the Book of Mormon, the only time that a boat is compared to the ark is during the story of the Jaredites, who are coming out of the Tower of Babel during a time when Noah is still alive, and therefore the story of the flood is still fresh in everybody's thoughts. What other boat would they compare their boats to other than the ark? The parallel draws more on the Bible than it does on the Late War. Parallel number 25. many uses of it came to pass. Again, this is drawing more from the Bible than it is from the late war. If we look in the Bible, the phrase "it came to pass" is used 387 times in the Old Testament, 65 times in the New Testament. This is a phrase common to ancient historians. So, Joseph Smith had no need to take it from the late war. He could have more easily taken it from the Bible, or, as the Book of Mormon purports to be an ancient record, it is more likely that it simply was written in by the original author. Those are all the parallels that are directly listed in the CES letter. The last one on their list just states many, many more parallels. Again, linking back to this other page that has much more detail on it. As I am doing just a response to the CES letter, I am going to leave it here. If there's any interest for me to look at this other paper and comment on it, let me know in the comments. Okay, going back to parallel 20. This is the only one in which they have any real grounds to stand on, but as it becomes the only one, it can be easily dismissed as a coincidence. But let us look at it real quick and we'll look at some of the details. It states here, a battle at a fort where righteous white protagonists are attacked by an army made up of dark-skinned natives driven by a white military leader. White protagonists are prepared for battle and slaughter their opponents to such an extent that they fill the trenches surrounding the fort with dead bodies. The surviving elements flee into the wilderness or forest. This is a calling back to a battle in the Book of Alma, where the Lamanites were led by Nephite dissenters to attack, the city of Noah, I do believe. And they kept fighting on, driven on by the Nephite dissenters, until all those Nephite dissenters were killed, at which point the Lamanites fled. And it does say that the trenches around the city were filled with the bodies of the dead. I will point out, however, that this is actually not an uncommon theme in many historical records of war, especially ancient war. When you have an army besieging a city, when they attack the wall, it is actually fairly common to describe the carnage resulting as filling the trenches. So that portion of the story is too general to mean anything. The only thing that they have some grounds to stand on is the fact that it was white leaders leading the darker-skinned Indians to attack a fort of white Americans. However, in the details it still falls apart, as in the Book of Mormon we have a large Lamanite population led by a very small minority of Nephite dissenters, while in the late war 1/3 of the army is British soldiers. They're not just being led by a white military leader, they have an entire contingent, an army of the British that are being supplemented by 1,000 Indians. But as I say, there is some substance to this claim of parallel. However, when we consider what the Book of Mormon claims to be, it is not surprising in that if the Book of Mormon was true, then this situation would have arisen, or is likely to have arisen more than once, as other races have come to America and mixed with the darker-skinned peoples here. If the Nephites did exist, a blending of the two races would have resulted in something similar to this happening, and when the Europeans come again, we would see the same thing happening. Therefore, while it is a parallel, it is a logical parallel given the history that is being claimed. So, that is the conclusion for my video on the late war between the United States and Great Britain. Probably a lot longer than I thought it would be, but that is my response. In general, the only real evidence shows a common influence in the Bible. That both the late war, because it is modeled off the Bible, and the Book of Mormon, because it is coming out of the Jewish and Israelitish traditions are both heavily influenced by the Old Testament. Other than that, the parallels are so broad that they are common to every historical account of almost every war. The very few that are not are things that we should expect if the Book of Mormon was true. It is truly, in the discussion of the Book of Mormon, the late war between the United States and Great Britain is truly meaningless.